It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon, and the summer heat made everything feel a little slower than usual. I was at home, sprawled out on the living room couch, half listening to a radio drama and half scrolling through my phone. Our family house had always been a busy place, cousins, uncles, and aunties coming and going like bees in a hive, but that day felt strangely still. That's when I noticed him, Samir, my cousin. He slipped past the front gate, eyes darting, steps unusually cautious. Samir was the kind of guy everyone liked. Tall, confident, always dressed sharply, and good with words. He had a way of charming people without even trying. We shared a bond, though not particularly close. Still, there was a mutual understanding built over shared childhood summers and teenage secrets. But that afternoon, something was off. Trailing behind him was a woman I didn't immediately recognize. She wore a loose pink shawl and walked a step behind him, head down. Her body language wasn't exactly fearful, but it wasn't relaxed either. Samir whispered something to her, and she nodded without speaking. Then they disappeared into the side wing of the house, his portion of the property. At first, I dismissed it. Samir often had friends over. But something lingered, a feeling, her hesitation, his nervousness, the way they avoided the front door like they didn't want to be seen. I tried to shake it off. But curiosity can be a powerful thing. I got up, walked toward the hallway, and stood silently for a moment, listening. The door to Samir's room was shut. I could hear muffled voices inside, his voice low and coaxing, hers soft, almost unsure. Then suddenly, a thump. I froze. I told myself I was overreacting. I took a deep breath, then walked to the door and knocked. Once, twice. No answer. I called out, "Samir?" Still silence. I hesitated, then slowly turned the doorknob. It was unlocked. What I saw stopped me cold. Samir was on top of her, his shirt half unbuttoned, his hand pressed against the wall above her head. She wasn't resisting. Her eyes were open, watching me, startled, but she wasn't smiling. Either. She looked like someone caught in a moment they didn't expect, or maybe didn't want. The room smelled faintly of perfume and tension. Samir sprang up, adjusting his shirt, his face flushed. "What are you doing here?" he barked, voice sharp. I didn't answer. I looked at her, really looked at her. Recognition hit me like a punch. She wasn't a stranger. She was the girl I once had feelings for, the one I thought I had a chance with. And now, she was here, with him. In that moment, 1,000 thoughts collided. But one thing was clear. This was no innocent visit, and what I'd walked into was just the beginning. And deep down, I knew. Nothing would be the same after today. Samir stood between us, trying to compose himself, but the damage was already done. The room felt heavier than before, like all the oxygen had been sucked out. The girl, Nadia, pulled her shawl tightly around her shoulders and turned away, her cheeks flushed not with embarrassment, but something closer to regret. I stepped back into the hallway, waiting for someone to say something, anything. Instead, Samir slammed the door shut behind me. A second later, it creaked open again and he stepped out, jaw clenched. "What exactly did you think you were doing?" he demanded, his voice low but sharp. "I could ask you the same," I said, trying to keep calm, though my pulse was racing. "You brought her here like you were smuggling contraband. What's going on, Samir?" He rolled his eyes and leaned against the wall. "It's none of your business, man. She's an adult. I'm an adult. Stay out of it." "But she's not. Just any woman," I shot back. "That's Nadia. You knew I used to like her." He gave a half laugh, the kind that's more insult than amusement. "Used to, that was ages ago. You never did anything about it anyway. What, were you expecting her to wait around for you forever?" That stung more than I expected. Because he was right. I never confessed, never made a move. But I'd always believed we had something unspoken, a quiet closeness. She smiled differently when I was around. She listened like what I said mattered. And now, she was in his room. With him. I looked past him, toward the barely open door. "Is she okay?" I asked quietly. She's fine, he said quickly. Too quickly. But before I could press further, Nadia stepped out. Her face was composed, but her eyes darted between us. It's okay, she said softly. I'm here because I want to be. Samir folded his arms like that settled it. But her words, they didn't feel true. Not completely. She looked at me with something almost like apology in her gaze. And in that second, I saw it. Hesitation, discomfort, and something else. Disappointment. We stood in silence for a moment that felt like an hour. Then she turned to Samir. I think I should go. He frowned but didn't stop her. I watched. Her walk out, her steps unsure, her shoulders tense. She didn't look back. Samir, ever the opportunist, just shrugged. You're overthinking it. Don't make it dramatic. But it already was. Not because of what I saw, but because of what it revealed. Samir had known how I felt about Nadia, and he'd still brought her here, hidden her, touched her, not because he loved her, but because he could. As I stood alone in the hallway, I realized betrayal isn't always loud. Sometimes it slips in quietly, wearing a familiar face and a casual grin. And this betrayal had just begun. The days that followed felt like walking through a fog. Every time I crossed paths with Samir, he acted like nothing had happened, as though the incident was just a misunderstanding I needed to forget. But I couldn't. Not when every corner of the house reminded me of what I'd seen. Not when Nadia's eyes, conflicted, almost pleading, kept flashing through my mind. We weren't a family that talked much about feelings. We grew up hiding bruises behind jokes and heartbreaks behind busy schedules. But this was different. This betrayal cut too deep to ignore. I decided to reach out to Nadia. I didn't want explanations, I wanted clarity. Closure. I found her. At a cafe near the university where she used to study. She looked surprised to see me, but she didn't turn away. We sat down quietly, letting the silence settle before either of us spoke. I didn't expect to see you, she said finally, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. I needed to understand, I replied. Was it real, or just something convenient? She exhaled slowly. I didn't go to his house thinking it would turn into that. He called, said he needed to talk. I thought it was about you. Me? My voice cracked before I could hide it. Nadia nodded. I always knew you had feelings, but you never said anything. And Samir? He made it seem like you'd moved on, that you weren't interested. He told me things, small, convincing lies that made me doubt what I felt. I leaned back, stunned by how easily the truth had been twisted. Why didn't you ask me? Because I was scared, she admitted. Scared I'd imagined everything. Scared you'd reject me. And Samir, he was confident, clear, and familiar. That was Samir's charm. He never hesitated. And people often mistook certainty for sincerity. Did you love him? I asked, even though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. She shook her head. No. I think I wanted to be loved, and he offered attention when I felt invisible. Her words stung, not because she'd chosen him, but because I'd allowed silence to replace courage. I'd let fear keep me from the one thing I truly wanted. I'm sorry, I said, though I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for, being late, being quiet, or being passive. Nadia gave a sad smile. Me too. As we stood to leave, she touched my arm gently. Take care of yourself. Don't let what he did define you. I watched her walk away for the second time, but this time it felt final. No lingering hopes. No illusions. Back home, I found Samir laughing over a phone call, as if the world hadn't shifted. And in that moment, I knew. We were no longer just cousins living under one roof. We were strangers separated by choice, trust, and the thin blade of betrayal. But something in me had changed. I wouldn't stay silent anymore. The weeks that followed were quieter, but not in a peaceful way. More like the silence that comes after a storm, where debris still litters. The ground and everything familiar looked slightly out of place. Samir carried on as though nothing had happened. His laughter echoed through the house, but to me it sounded hollow, forced, like a mask stretched too tight. We barely spoke. Something between us had died, and neither of us had the words or the will to resurrect it. I spent more time alone, walking through parts of the neighborhood I used to love as a kid. Old shops, dusty cricket grounds, the banyan tree where Nadia and I once sat during a summer festival, sharing secrets under lantern lights. That memory came back uninvited, and this time it didn't sting. It just lingered, soft and sad. 1. Evening, while helping my aunt clean the attic, I found a photo album buried in a stack of old newspapers. Inside were pictures of Samir and me, smiling, arms slung around each other, unaware of how time would stretch and twist that bond. I stared at one particular photo, where Nadia stood in the background, laughing, sunlight catching the strands of her hair. None of us had known what was coming. Later that night, I sat on the rooftop, looking at the same stars that once watched, us laugh and dream like nothing could touch us. I realized then that betrayal doesn't always come from enemies. Sometimes it comes from those you once called brother. Samir joined me on the roof without asking. He lit a cigarette and sat beside me, saying nothing. For a while, the only sound was the crackle of burning tobacco and the distant barking of street dogs. "You still mad?" he finally asked. I didn't answer right away. "You knew how I felt about her," I said, "and you didn't care." Samir sighed. "I didn't think it mattered. You never told her. You never claimed anything." "She wasn't something to claim," I replied. "She was someone I respected." He didn't respond. Maybe because he had nothing honest to say. Maybe because he didn't feel regret. Just inconvenience. "I'm moving out," I said after a long pause. That caught him off guard. "Seriously?" "Yeah, I need space. From this place. From all of this." He gave a short nod but didn't argue. Maybe he saw the resolve in my eyes. Maybe deep down he knew he'd lost something too. I left 3 days later with a single suitcase and a clearer heart. No drama, no scenes, just a quiet goodbye to a chapter that had run its course. I never saw Nadia again. But I carried the lesson with me. Silence is not protection, and love, when left unspoken, becomes a story unfinished. And as I stepped into a new life, I promised myself, next time, I'd speak before the silence had a chance to betray me.